You ever wonder what happens to you when you die? Well, I have a little idea of it. People die at all ages and of all types of causes. Sometimes it's by injury, sometimes it's by disease, but sometimes old men and women just die in their sleep. People who are perfectly healthy, just old. There really is no explanation for why they die, but they do. There was a little test done in the 1950s to see if this could be explained. They took 10 subjects who were at least 80 years old and asked them if they would stay in a facility until they died. These people were particularly aged. You could tell they didn't have long left. As each one died, something peculiar happened. Just before their hearts stopped, their brain readings became incredibly erratic, but they still matched a certain pattern, that of a person having a nightmare. The worst nightmare anyone had ever seen. Their faces stayed perfectly calm, along with their bodies, but they were not calm. One of the test subjects survived. He seemed like a very resilient man. He had the brain readings, same as the others, but his heart did not stop. Instead, he awoke with a scream and jerked up violently. The scientists rushed to him and asked what had happened in his mind. He said it was the most terrifying thing anyone could ever see, that it was the reason people die in their sleep. He said that dying in your sleep was not peaceful. It was the worst experience you could ever have. And as he was about to tell them what had happened, his eyes rolled back into his head and he collapsed onto the bed. He had died from exhaustion. His heart failed completely. The scientists were baffled. The project was stopped there. They refused to put any more people through this experience. The results were locked away, hidden from the eyes of the world. It was lost in the government machine for the public never to see. But one of the scientists was not satisfied with this. Many years later, he was of the age where he could die in his sleep. He remembered the project from years ago and decided to find out what the old man was about to tell them. He spent quite some time preparing his old heart for anything that could come at it. He wanted to make sure he stayed alive. One night, he went to sleep, same as always, but his dream was different. He was in the dark, with a small light emanating from what seemed to be a bathroom. He couldn't stop himself from walking towards it. He opened the door. There was one small flickering light, a dirty-looking mirror, a broken-down toilet, and a shower, which seemed to be in the same condition. The floor was cold concrete, and there was a sink. It seemed perfectly normal. He felt himself being forced to wash his face. He looked up from the sink into the mirror and saw himself. He looked perfectly normal as well. He wiped his face off, reopened his eyes, and saw his reflection again, but it was much, much different this time. The person and the reflection seemed to be him, but they were different. It was as if someone had taken him out of the grave around 6 months later. The figure was decayed, but still retained some resemblance to him. The scientist was paralyzed with fear, but not paralyzed enough to stop himself from fulfilling an incredible urge to reach out towards it. He slowly moved his hand towards the mirror. Instead of having his hand stopped by cold glass, it kept going towards the figure. He whipped his hand back with incredible shock and fear. The figure slowly started to speak. He said in a raspy, degraded version of the scientist's voice, "Everyone has their time. You were lucky enough to last this long, but your time has come. Prepare yourself." The figure then moved towards him. He looked for any escape whatsoever, but the door had disappeared. He was trapped in that room. His fear completely froze him from any movement, and the figure suddenly rushed at him, screaming a more terrifying scream than you could ever imagine in your entire lifetime. As soon as it made contact with him, he woke up. He sat up violently, heaving massive breaths. The scientist realized immediately what he had just experienced. He quickly grabbed a piece of blank paper that was sitting on the desk next to him. He had prepared this beforehand just in case. He scribbled out the words as quickly as he could, for he knew that his heart was about to collapse. The paper said, "Die before you sleep." He then threw the paper and pencil down and expected to die right then, but he didn't. He looked over to the exit from his room. Standing there was the figure from his nightmare. The figure whispered, "You didn't think you could get away that easily, did you?" The scientist's eyes widened with terrible fear. He managed to whisper, What are you?" The figure rushed towards the side of his bed and whispered in his ear, "I am God." And with those words, the scientist died. The scientist was a lonely man. All of his family were dead, and he had but one friend. Nobody found the body for months. But one day, his friend came to visit. He went to his house and knocked on the door. No answer. After a few seconds, he smelled an incredibly horrid stench coming from the house. He walked around to the back and looked in the bedroom window. Inside, it was dark, but he could make out the decaying figure of his friend, who had been in there, dead for months. The figure almost exactly matched the one that had caused him to die. He called the cops, and they picked up his body. The cause of death was simply declared old age, but they found the paper next to his bed. It was filed away in evidence, and there were a few local newspaper stories about it, and so everyone kept on believing that dying of old age was natural, and dying in your sleep was the most painless method to go by. Well, good for them. In the small town of Stoll, Kansas, there once stood an old one-room chapel on top of a hill, surrounded by graves. Beside the church was a cellar that was very difficult to find, as its doors had grass grown upon them. In front of the church was a great tree that was always bare. None of the town's members could recall ever having seen a leaf upon its branches. In the town's earliest years, well before the Civil War, there were several farming families that lived there. The minister's daughter had fallen madly in love with a boy from nearby, but had her heart broken when that young man was discovered to have impregnated a certain flirtatious townsgirl. The two were married, and all the while the reverend's daughter saw them happy together, and her hatred brewed until after 9 months of painful endurance, that despisal boiled over. Shortly after the young couple's child was born, the minister's daughter went to their house. They greeted her cheerfully, but noticed, all too late, how she eyed the child bloodthirstily. She slit the throats of those two who'd made her life so miserable, and then dragged their bodies, along with the newborn child, up the hill to the church. She put the bodies in the cellar and left the baby there, between their bodies, to starve to death. She locked the cellar shut and hung herself on the tree in front of the church. The bodies in the cellar were not found for 3 weeks. From that day on, leaves never grew on that tree. If you walk the graveyard late at night, you can just hear the sound of a baby's chilling cry. The townspeople burnt down the tree many years ago in the hopes of putting the minister's daughter's spirit to rest, and more recently, the church collapsed onto itself, burying the already difficult to find down the cellar. Many have looked for its doors, but the few who have found them and ventured beneath its depths have seldom returned, with the exception of a few who came back to the sunlight after 3 weeks beneath, starved nearly to death and covered in blood that was not their own. I sat down at the table, setting my plate in front of me. On it was a thick, juicy slab of a cheeseburger with strips of bacon on it and barbecue sauce dripping down the sides, and a helping of fries, each the size of a man's finger. I lifted up the burger. Sauce was already on my fingers as I took a bite. It was possibly the best thing I ever tasted, and it was my usual order whenever I was at this restaurant. I licked my lips clean of sauce and kept eating, savoring each bite. Once I finished the burger, I ate the fries, just as good. After I was full to bursting, I stood up and saw the manager, a tall, round New York Italian guy. "Hey," he exclaimed, "just the guy I was looking for." "Nice seeing you, Tony," I said, grinning ear to ear. "Anything for me today?" The restaurant also served as a deli. Take your pick of their finest meat and you could take it home. Me being a frequent customer and a friend since childhood of the manager got me a good discount. "Yeah, we just got a new shipment. That burger you ordered was fresh from it. Come on, pal." I followed him into the back, and he closed the door behind him as he fiddled with a lock on another door. Opening it up, I looked around at the meat hanging from the ceilings, ripe for the picking. Now I knew why that burger was so good. "How about some ribs?" I said, pointing to a fat man's corpse hanging from the ceiling by meat hooks in his ankle, chunks of flesh already taken off his bones, his arms and a leg missing.